I've already thanked you all for coming. Those of you here tonight that have heard David Irving speak are aware of his abilities of an orator, and no doubt that's why you've come. Those who are not familiar with his speaking abilities but have read his books will not be disappointed. Anyone here not familiar with tonight's speaker is in for a real treat. Those of you who have not yet been exposed to history that has been made according to the facts may be in for a surprise. If that's the case, do not be aggravated at the bearer of the truth, but rather the repeater of the lies. The works of David Irving are irrefutably documented, so much so that his 15-year-old $1,000 challenge to anyone that proves him wrong remains uncollected. On the other hand, however, we have the documentaries and historical accounts by the mainstream media. The same people who give us things like the disgusting WEBN billboards and the Mapplethorpe exhibits. One should be suspect of even the page numbers used by people who produce such trash. Because a solid understanding of history is present and anticipating the future, people are most interested in historical questions during times of crisis, or when the future seems most uncertain. Today is a good time for an interest in history. Too many people are aware of the symptoms of our trouble but cannot finger the cause. Like ice water thrown on heavy sleepers, the Clinton administration has been shock therapy to wake up complacent Americans to the symptoms. But how many realize the extent that disease-ridden internationalist parasites have infected our republic, independent of the Clintons? Americans need to understand and inform themselves on the origins and causes of the present ills we suffer from. We must destroy the roots of this ignominious growth before it takes us over. It will cure little to focus only on the Clinton administration as the main problem, offensive though it is. To remedy our current situation, we must cut away the dead tissue remaining from all the previous internationalist, socialistic, and anti-Christian policies upon which these parasites feed. We must reevaluate the propaganda and lies leveled at us from media and government throughout this century, perhaps even earlier. Surely no one thinks that today's treasonous policies were hatched or suckled overnight. This is relatively easy to qualify by pointing at just a few examples of the various tactics, lies, and deceptions spewed at us throughout this century, such as the Federal Reserve Acts of 1913 and 1933. Our money is controlled by a few international banking houses, not by Congress. As Amschel Rothschild once stated, "Let me control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws." We were dragged into it of these international, of course, to justify for the men leaving their wives and mothers to go fight a war across the ocean. Americans were bombarded with propaganda. Unfortunately, the truth and what people are told are very seldom the same. This is true especially in the time of war. One of the most internationalist, socialistic, communist sympathizing men we've had in the White House to date was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Despite some of his campaign speeches, his desire was great to again embroil the U.S. into war at the behest of the international bankers. Again, the propaganda machine worked overtime to stir up hatred of the Germans. With Bolshevik communism as our ally, we were told that Russia's victories were our victories, that America had to fight to save the world, to save democracy, that we had to fight for freedom. What we actually did was save communism for Europe. Our intervention not only kept the bloodiest regime in history alive, it added to its expansion. At Yalta, Roosevelt and Churchill acquiesced to Stalin the peoples and countries of Eastern Europe. So much for our fight for freedom. As the Hungarians have said, gladly would we suffer again the worst experiences of our history, even the waging of world war on our own soil, but God save us from another liberation. In spite of the now popular so-called victory celebrations, this country has plenty of room for regret. Adding to the deceitful global policeman policies, we were also lied to about the income tax, Social Security, welfare, the Korean War, Vietnam, the missing POWs, and on and on. If Americans had a better understanding of the sellouts that have been perpetrated by so many preceding administrations, which definitely include Republican ones, people would be ashamed to advertise things like, "Don't blame me, I voted for Bush." Today the terms conservative and liberal are so bandied about, they have about as much contrast in usage as a Republican and Democrat. The only difference between a conservative Republican internationalist and a liberal Democrat one is the ride. Your destination is the same. People who understand this are reviled as isolationists. The best definition of an isolationist that I've heard to date is someone who is against the subsidizing or the slaughter of foreigners. Some great men of the past who have been reviled as isolationists are vindicated by historians such as David Irving. David Irving was born in Essex, England in 1938. He is the son of a Royal Navy commander. He received his college education at London University. As an example of Irving's dedication to accuracy, he worked for a whole year in a steel mill in Germany to perfect his fluency and knowledge in the German language. While working there, Irving began gathering information on the history of those cities that had experienced the full impact of Allied bombardment during World War II. After 4 years of research, his first book, The Destruction of Dresden, was published. It was 1963, and he was 23 years old. This book alone has sold over 1 million copies. He has been described as Britain's most financially successful historian. His bestseller, The Desert Fox, earned $250,000 in U.S. paperback rights alone. In 1967, Hugh Trevor Roper described him as one of the, quote, "few guys I would entirely trust, indefatigable in pursuit of evidence, fearless in the face of it, sound in judgment," end quote. In 1971, the London Times said, "David Irving takes his place in the first rank of historical chroniclers." Irving, who had been highly acclaimed both by critics and the world's most prestigious publishing houses, fell from their grace with Hitler's war when he chose to stick with the facts uncovered in his 10 years of research put into the book, thus proving that Irving is more interested in truth than book sales. He was especially reviled after his book Uprising, which pulled no punches about the Hungarian uprising of 1956. He was subsequently blacklisted by the ADL of the B'nai B'rith. This meant that he was shut out of the big-name publishing houses despite their praise of him in the past. Rather than wilt under this discriminatory treatment, Irving turned to alternate publishers, rented a truck, and personally delivered his books to over 480 bookstores throughout England. Determined to defeat him, but always unwilling to meet him for debate, his rivals have used various methods in their attempts to dispose of him, such as burglary, arson, and false arrest. Burglary in that Gerald Gable, a former communist election candidate and later a weekend television producer, big surprise, huh, was convicted for burglarizing Irving's flat using a stolen post office identity card. He admitted membership in an underground organization which had ordered him to steal Irving's research papers to prevent the work on his next book. Arson in that the Sussex printing works where Irving's magazine Focal Point was produced was burnt to the ground by one of Gable's associates, who was caught red-handed and later received the prison sentence. False arrest in countries such as Austria and Canada, which it's possible the author may touch upon tonight in his talk. Through all of this, the world's most combative and prolific historian remains undaunted, and although his tenacity and obstinacy for the truth has cost him no small amount, his works are still being published by impressive firms and widely read despite the efforts of his enemies. To quote his slogan, "The fight continues to final victory," expensive though it is. With men of Irving's character, we stand on the shoulders of giants. But in his case, we may even reach farther by standing on a stack of his books. Books that you can count on due to his British obstinacy to uncover the truth, an act for which he has become famous. Lastly, we will pass around the hat tonight to pay for tonight's expenses. Room rental alone is nearly $500, and the refreshments are extra. There was no door charge because it was hoped that everyone would give what they could afford. All money over expenses go to support David Irving in his fight for truth. Please be generous. Now it is my pleasure to introduce and welcome our eloquent speaker, the very British historian, David Irving. We'll go ahead and start passing around the hat.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I guess there wasn't very much else on in Cincinnati tonight. I'm astonished at the numbers of you who have turned out to hear me. I know very few of the faces who are here this evening, and very few of you have met me. The hour that I'm going to speak, we'll have a 10 or 15-minute break after that, and then I'll be very happy to take any questions that you want to ask, any kind of discussion after that. So let's have no interruptions while I'm talking. We'll have a discussion after the interval. I'm hoping that you will find it a rewarding journey, the coming 60 minutes. Talking of journeys, I've been on the road for the last 7 days, driving up from the very southernmost point of the United States. And over the next 3 weeks, my speaking tour, which tonight is the first actual engagement, will take me in a zigzag course from here right up to the Great Lakes and across to New Jersey and back down to the southernmost point in Key West. And then the very next day over to Los Angeles, and I drive up to Seattle and back, and then across to Denver and Colorado, all between now and October the 23rd, and I do this every year. And you can begin to understand why I'm a thorn in the side of certain people who have a vested interest in propagating their own version of history, which may have very little to do with American interests or with British interests, but it has become big business. And the latter part of my talk will be devoted really to examining parts of that great legend. This drive up here from the southernmost point has, however, been useful in one way, because it has enabled me to brush up on my spoken American. I speak quite a lot of languages. We learn a lot of languages at school. We learn, in my case, French and German and Russian and Latin and all the other useful or useless languages that you need in your journey through life. But nobody ever told me as a writer that I was going to need to learn American. Not until I wrote my Adolf Hitler biography, which is published over here by the Viking Press, one of the great names in the publishing industry. And that's when I first discovered that writers, if they want to succeed in life, have to learn to write and read and speak a kind of mid-Atlantic English. It was Winston Churchill, I think, who once said, or was it before him, George Bernard Shaw, that the English language, that the British and the American peoples are divided by a common language. And I didn't understand how true that was until this book was being edited by my American editor, Stan Hoffman. And he would come on sentences in this book which showed to me how very different our language. For example, there's a passage after the bomb attempt on Adolf Hitler's life, in July 1944, when the traitors have put a bomb under Adolf Hitler's table in an attempt to kill him at the war's darkest pass for Germany. And he survives that attempt, shaken but not stirred, and he goes down into his bunker bedroom with his pants, or I would say his trousers, in tatters, in his shirt sleeves, and he sits on the edge of his bed in his shirt sleeves and braces, and feels his own pulse, 73. And he says to his doctor, whose diary I found, "You see, quite normal, 73. And I describe this in the book, and my American editor says, "Dave, a great scene, I like it, but we're going to have to change that sentence a bit. You can't say the Fuhrer sat on the edge of his bed in his shirt sleeve and braces and felt his pulse. It's going to have to be, he sat on the edge of his bed in his shirt sleeves and suspenders." Now, what you don't know is that in England, suspenders is what a woman wears to hold her stockings up. What you would call a garter belt. So the idea of the Fuhrer of the Greater German Reich being some kind of prevert who sits in his bedroom wearing a lady's garter belt to hold his stockings up. There was no way around it. That sentence had to go. We had to cut it out. And then we had Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister. I describe in one part how Joachim von Ribbentrop, he had a skeleton in the cupboard too. That's the English expression. The mid-American editor, Stan Hochman, says, David, we're going to have to change that. It's going to have to be Ribbentrop had a skeleton in the closet. Now in England, a closet or water closet is what you people call a bathroom. Not that we English tourists expect now to find a bath in that bathroom. It's what the Australians call a dunny, or you Americans call a john. I mean, it's a language problem. That sentence had to go as well. We're tyrannized by language. And so that sentence was cut out. It's part of the growing up process of being an author. You learn how to write. I like the American language. I think it's a very virile language, or virile, you would say, virile language. I like to talk of trucks instead of lorries because it has a bit more punch, that word. And so you'll find my books, those of you who've read them, that I've got a kind of mid-Atlantic argot, which I've adopted for my books. So I thoroughly irritate everybody now. It annoys the English people who write to me and say, don't you know how to spell labour and favour, Mr. Irving? Don't you know they have U's in those words over here? And of course I annoy the American readers who find all sorts of anglicisms. This English touch, which irritates the pants off the American readers, and in particular my editors. I had a general who was being summoned to Hitler, and it was quite obvious that he was going to be sentenced to death. And I say the general was sentenced to Hitler, and it was obvious he couldn't expect a promotion that afternoon. And my editor, he said, you English write that kind of thing with a kind of levity. But we Americans, we can't get away with it. So that sentence had to go as well. It irritates people. But I've been accustomed to irritating people the last 20 or 30 years because I'm an independent writer. I'm independent in as much as I don't work for anyone and I can't be sacked. I've got no university position. I'm not a professor. I'm not a doctor, which is very important in Germany to have a doctor's title in front of your name. Even chimney sweeps are doctor this and doctor that in Germany or Austria. I'm just plain Mr. David Irving, so I can't be dismissed. I can't be dismissed from a school. I can't be dismissed now from a publishing house because I've set up my own publishing house. When I published the new edition of this book in England, I set up what is called my own imprint, because I recognize that the day is going to come when so much pressure has been put by these vested interests on my publishers around the world that I don't have another publisher left who's going to publish me unless I've built my own publishing house. So I did that too. I've set up my own publishing imprint in England called Focal Point. That's the big F on the back, not Führer, not fascist, not anything else. Just Focal Point, the publishing imprint. And the only thing that my enemies in England can do now, and they've been trying it, is when I started selling this book, and as Rick said, I've been around a lot of bookshops in England. I like it. It's not 450 bookshops. In fact, the actual total now is 870 bookshops in England who sell my books, directly delivered by me, and they can't be intimidated. Or perhaps they can, because for a long time, these people, the people I call the traditional enemies of the truth, they indulged 2 years ago in a stone-throwing campaign. They started smashing the windows of every big bookstore that still stocked my books in an attempt to persuade the bookstore managers through their insurance companies, through the back door, not to sell my books. And it's an interesting spectacle, this, because I look on this, I don't mind. I'm not in it for the money. Unlike the traditional enemy, as I call them, I'm not in anything for the money. My poor wife, she's sometimes frantic with fear as to what's going to happen next week or the week after that. In this small confidential circle, ladies and gentlemen, I can mention the fact that a week ago I won a colossal libel action against one of England's biggest newspapers. Purely by chance, they libelled me on July the 30th. They published something really stupid about me that was so stupid that there was no feasible defense. They took a document that I had published in 1982, a document in which Adolf Hitler, years ago, 70 years ago, with a Bavarian financier, back in 1922, Hitler talking to the Bavarian financier in the Hotel 4 Jahreszeiten in Munich, and Hitler saying to this financier, if I ever come to power, which he did, of course, 15 years later, if I ever come to power, then I am going to settle scores with the Jews. Then, he said, I've spent all my life fighting the Jews, not as a race, but as a religion. If I come to power, then there's going to be a solution of the Jewish problem. And I found the actual shorthand record taken by this financier's secretary of the conversation between these two men back in 1922, when both of them, the financier and Adolf Hitler, were hardly heard of. and I published this in 1982 in a journal I published called Focal Point. And the stupid newspaper on July the 30th this year published that document with a small mistake. They thought it was I who said these words. I spent all my life fighting the Jews. When I come to power, there's going to be a solution of the Jewish problem. No, there's no defense. Under the libel laws of England, they had no defense whatsoever. And so I served the writ on them. I took them to the court, and we solved the whole matter within the last 2 months. A very enjoyable experience. It shows that you can fight back, and I am fighting back now. Because I'm tired of taking, as I told the newspapers, thank you, as I told the newspaper lawyers as we went into court, I said, for 30 years I've had to put up, gritting my teeth with you newspapers, saying slimy things about me in a roundabout way so that you could just get off the hook if I sued you. And I've been waiting for the open and shut case which would give me the chance to do what I'm doing today. And that's when that day came. And they hated me for it, but they had to write out the check, and it came a week ago. And until then, it's been touch and go. But I'm going to be invulnerable now for the next year or two, so I can resume saying what I've always wanted to say. As Rick told you, I am a professional historian. That is to say, I'm not an academic historian. I don't spend my life sitting behind a desk in a university or a school with no time to go out into the field doing research. I write my books from the archives. When I wrote my very first book, The Destruction of Dresden, I took trouble to find 300 Allied airmen who took part in that catastrophic air raid on Dresden in 1945. Survivors who had been on the ground at the receiving end of that appalling air raid which killed over 100,000 people in 20 minutes. We did that. I never knew about that. When I was a steel worker in Germany, working in the steelworks in 1960, one of my fellow steelworkers told me what happened that night in Dresden, and I was ashamed because I, as an Englishman, had never been told that. And I thought, if I've never been told that, then probably 50 million other English people have never been told that too. And I decided to go and research that. First, I was going to write just a newspaper article. Then I realized it was far bigger than that. It was a major story. When that book was published by a little respectable English publishing house back in 1963, and it was serialized by England's Sunday Telegraph newspaper, which really gave it the push to make sure the book was a success. The book became a bestseller. And suddenly, those of you young people sitting in the audience here who still don't know what you're going to do when you grow up, take heart from me from the fact that at that time I was 23 years old and I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. I didn't know what I was going to do, but that book became a bestseller, and so I decided to become a writer. I decided to become a historian, and that's what I did for the next few years. I've done it from then until now, in fact. For the first few years, it was a pretty routine matter, humdrum. I wrote a book and I had a daughter, and I wrote another book and I had another daughter, and I wrote a third book and I had a third daughter, and I wrote a fourth book and I had a fourth daughter. And then for 30 years I ran out of steam and I just wrote books. Until about a year ago. I've got a 2-year-old daughter now, so I've got 5 daughters. It's a history of misfortune, I suppose. But the books have continued to come. I've written 30 books since then, and now most of them have vanished. They're not available on the table now. In fact, this evening I've sold the final remaining copies of 2 or 3 of my titles. I found them, unfortunately, among the effects of the man who I commissioned to set up a bookstore for me here in South Carolina 18 months ago. And he was doing a fine job until he was shot in his sleep in the back of his head, execution style, on February the 23rd this year, down in Greer in South Carolina. We still don't know what's behind that. And I had the sad duty on my drive up here in the last 5 or 6 days of picking up the remaining stock of books from him and loading them aboard the car. 30 books. What is it that distinguishes my books from all the rest? Why do the other historians get mad as hell when they hear my name? Why is it that they cheer when I get thrown into prison, as I was for 2 weeks last year? No court hearing, no trial, just picked up from my front door by Scotland Yard police officers, very apologetic, saying, "We're very sorry, Mr. Irving, we've got a High Court judge's order that we've got to take you straight to Pentonville prison for the next 3 months." And then I get the private papers of the Australian Prime Minister delivered to me a few months later in the course of my worldwide campaign for the truth, and I find that these people down in Australia had actually applied to the judge for me to be sent to prison for 2 years for contempt of court, to silence me. And that's what it's all about. And then when I managed to get freed from prison back in February last year, my solicitor, round-eyed with astonishment, saying, "Mr. Irving, what on earth is going on?" And even more astonished when he hears the people on the other side saying, we apply for Mr. Irving's passport to be impounded. That's what it's all about. They're trying to gag me and fetter me and chain me to one place because I go around the world speaking my mind and telling audiences like yourselves what I found in the archives. And it was quite a wide world originally. I used to go around the world once every year, the same as I now go around the United States, speaking to audiences in South Africa and Australia and New Zealand and Canada, everywhere. Not one of those countries is now available to let me in. I was deported in handcuffs from Canada in November 1992 on the instructions and at the request of the people that I call the traditional enemy of the truth. They had the money, they had the clout, they had the press behind them, and I fought them for 3 weeks in the Canadian courts, beginning in Vancouver and ending up in the courts in Ontario until finally, to our astonishment, and to the astonishment actually of the press, I was ordered deported in handcuffs and put onto a plane in handcuffs at Toronto Airport and flown back to Britain. And since then it's been a running battle, but it's been a very interesting battle because I had the means now worldwide to fight back. I've got 3,000 people around the world who contribute to my campaign to enable me to fight these actions. And if you fight actions on this scale, you find extraordinary things. In the United States, you've got the Freedom of Information Act. In Canada, they've got the Access to Information Act. If you fight a libel action in Australia, you can force the other side, suddenly, by an action called discovery, to show you all their cards, as though it's game. They are ordered to show you all the papers they've collected against you, and then you find extraordinary things. Historians, professors who in England have written me oily, ingratiating letters saying, Irving, what wonderful books you write. I would be so grateful if you could give me a clue about where I can find this, or can you let me have a copy of that? These same people writing and handwriting to the director of an organization in England, who I won't mention, writing to the director of this organization in England saying, can't you possibly take some steps to ensure that the next time Irving goes to Germany, he's thrown in prison for a long, long time? And then the director of that organization writing an appropriate letter to the German ambassador saying, next time Mr. Irving goes to Germany on a speaking tour, can you possibly arrange for him to be arrested and put in prison for a while? And all these letters turning up in the files of the Canadian government, which is where I found them. And these people in England still don't realize I've got photocopies of these letters. I'm going to be using them later on in yet another publication. It's a very... they're not going to have an enjoyable time, these people. I started 2 operations, ladies and gentlemen. One of them is called Operation Bodyline, and the other one is called Operation Ill Wind, as in it is an ill wind that blows nobody any good. These people are going to find that I'm the one who's going to benefit from this ill wind over the next 12 months. Because I'm a fighter and I fight back. When I was banned from Australia 2 years ago, as it turned out, the Australian Prime Minister, Paul Keating, had personally issued the instruction that I was not to be allowed in again. We know this because the judge ordered that the Prime Minister's file should be opened, and he was the one who took the decision. And it turned out that he had been bribed by these organizations of the traditional enemy of the truth not to let me in. They were the ones who were paying the Australian Labour Party colossal sums of money, and so he had to dance to their tune. And he was the one who ordered I shouldn't be allowed in. And when I wasn't allowed in to Australia, all the Australian media, to my astonishment, came down on my side. There wasn't an Australian newspaper which didn't stand up for me and for freedom of speech. They would say all the usual things like why we find Mr. Irving's views detestable and repugnant. They always say that kind of thing, because if you say one thing about journalists, you can't say they're brave. Journalists are not brave people. I have not the slightest sympathy for journalists anywhere in the world, because they are morally repugnant to me. They are what the Germans call Charakterschweine, the whole bunch of them. They are all dependent on their editors' say-so for their jobs, and they write what they are on autopilot. They know what they've got. They're not censored by anyone, but they know instinctively what they've got to write. And so they all say, while we don't hold anything of Mr. Irving's repugnant views and his disgusting opinions, we do stand up for his right to express. We do stand up for freedom of speech. And the Australians would telephone me, and I would do live television programs to Australia from my house in England. And the Australian journalists say, Mr. Irving, why is it then that you're keeping on this fight? Why is it that you're carrying on the battle like this? And I would say, I've been underestimated. You've underestimated the English. The English have a reputation, ladies and gentlemen, for marching to the sound of gunfire. We march toward the sound of gunfire. If they would stop firing their guns, I'd stop marching. But my enemies have not realized this yet. And so the battle goes on. And I mentioned the fact that I would give these interviews from my home in England, and I would broadcast live by satellite to the whole of the Australian continent. This is the benefit, of course. If they didn't ban me from Australia, I would be speaking to audiences of perhaps 20 or 30 people in the outback, outside Shepparton or Melbourne or somewhere. But as it is, I'm speaking live coast to coast on primetime television several nights a week when these campaigns are running in Australia. I was interviewed in my home, and here's something for you Americans to think about and chew over. I was interviewed in my home in July 2 years ago by France's biggest newspaper, and I gave an opinion to this journalist sitting in my study in London near the American embassy, and this journalist reported my opinion quite faithfully in Le Monde, the biggest French serious newspaper, and that journalist and that newspaper and I were subsequently fined last year in the French courts for having expressed this opinion. I'll tell you later on what the opinion is, but think about that. When you sometimes complain about the restraints you live under in the United States of America, take it from me as an outsider. You have something here that is wonderful, and that's the First Amendment. The freedom of speech, which is constitutionally guaranteed to you United States citizens, is something that you're so accustomed to, you take it for granted. Don't take it for granted. Fight to protect it. Fight to stand up to prevent anybody from making any inroads against that First Amendment which guarantees your freedom of speech. Because otherwise situations will develop like the one I'm about to describe in France, where I express an opinion in the safety and security and sanctuary of my own home in London, and I find myself receiving an indictment from a Paris court accusing me of having made a certain statement in my own home in England. I've not been in France for 7 or 8 years. And then being fined in absentia by the French court for this opinion I've expressed, which has been published by one of the leading newspapers. But it gets worse, because the indictment that is served on me is served on me under a new law passed in France, a law for the amendment of the freedom of speech. Think of those words, a law for the amendment of the freedom of speech in France. And under that law, it becomes a criminal offense for anybody to challenge, or the French word is contester, to challenge or ask questions about crimes against humanity as defined by the Nuremberg Tribunal of 1945. Now, we all know what tribunal that was. That was the victors' tribunal against the Nazis, who were put on trial and eventually hanged. They were railroaded to the gallows. I think it was Lord Van Sittart who said the only question which is of interest now is going to be the place of the gallows and the length of the rope. That was roughly the mood of justice which prevailed at Nuremberg. You couldn't expect justice in that kind of climate. The Germans didn't expect it. They knew they weren't going to get justice, and they didn't get justice. But one thing is quite plain, that it should be possible for us now, historians, 50 years after the event, to re-examine those events, to re-examine the indictments as served up at Nuremberg, the crimes that the Germans were accused of, and say, was this a crime? Did this happen like that? In France, for example, it is a criminal offense, to give you one example, it is a criminal offense to go to France and say, I don't think it was the Russians. I don't think it was the Nazis who killed the Poles at Katyn, in the Katyn forest in 1940. I think it was really the Russians. I think it was the Russian secret police. We now know it was the Russian secret police who did that, because the Russians have admitted it. Mr. Gorbachev has admitted it, Mr. Yeltsin has admitted, the Russians have actually given the Polish government photocopies of the murder warrants, the death warrants that were signed by the Soviet secret police for the 15,000 Polish officers who were murdered as prisoners of war in the forests of Katyn near Smolensk in 1940. So there's no question about that particular crime. But at Nuremberg, it was the Germans who were accused of having murdered those 15,000 Polish officers. So anybody who goes to France now and challenges that fact is committing a criminal offense. And they're going to be fined like me, and that newspaper, and that journalist. But it gets worse, because it is a criminal offense to mention these crimes, to mention the challenging of these crimes. So the indictment that was served on me said, Mr. Irving, you are accused of having, in July 1993, given an interview to a journalist of Le Monde, in which you stated, I do not believe that the ... existed. And the words ... are followed by brackets with the words censored under the Fabius-Gasso law of 1990. So they're not even allowed to mention those words in the indictment, telling you what you're being charged with. This is how, and the reason for that is simple, because part of the penalty in France, when you've been found guilty of something in France like that, is not only you find some horrendous sum, Not only are you ordered to pay all the legal costs of all the lawyers who've turned out against you, and it isn't only the lawyers of the government who are against you, you find suddenly in court against you lawyers representing all sorts of strange organizations, of communist veterans and Jewish victims and this kind of thing. They've all got their lawyers in court representing these associations and organizations. They've all got an interest in seeing Mr. Irving punished, and the judge will say, Mr. Irving, you will pay a fine, and you will pay compensation to these, you'll pay those lawyers, you'll pay compensation to that organization, that organization. Every organization represented in court gets a nice handout, and the final penalty is that you are also ordered to publicize in a display advertisement in 5 of France's biggest newspapers the full details of the offense and the penalty. And that, of course, is the most savage, swinging financial penalty, because you know what display advertising costs. And they don't want in that advertisement that you're going to put in the newspapers announcing your penalty, they don't want you to repeat, of course, what you've been charged with. That's why that's been cut out of the indictment. It's all a bit Orwellian. It's all, if you've ever read Animal Farm or 1984, you understand what I'm talking about. The things that George Orwell wrote about in the 1940s and 1950s as being an absurd situation which might one day happen, have already happened in many countries in Europe and around the world because vested interests are trying to protect legends. So what are these legends? I've got no vested interest one way or the other. If I say, as I do, I don't believe in the legend of the Holocaust as it is at present propagated, it's not because I've got a vested interest. I'm not making money out of saying that. No one's going to come up to me afterwards and say, you've done well, Irving, here's the money I promised you for saying that. No one's going to say that. I'm saying it because it's the conclusion that I've come to. And the fact that I say that, in fact, doesn't earn me money, it costs me money. My agent, when I published this book, originally in 1977, Max Becker, a dear old American literary agent, one of the best, when I delivered the manuscript to me, he said, David, we've got a problem with your Hitler book. Where are the 15 pages on the Holocaust? I said, Max, there aren't 15 pages on the Holocaust. He said, well, yeah, but you've got to write them. You've got to put them in. You can't write a biography of Adolf Hitler without putting at least 15 pages on the Holocaust. And I say, Max, my problem is I've written this book based on the archives. I knew all Adolf Hitler's private people. I got to know all his private secretaries. All the girls who had worked as typists for Adolf Hitler, I spent 10 years winning their trust and getting them to look under their beds and find their old cardboard boxes full of diaries and private letters and papers that they'd written. I spent 10 years finding out what really happened based on the archives, and in all those archives around the world, there aren't those 15 pages you're talking about, Max. There's not one single sheet of paper linking Adolf Hitler with what you call the Holocaust, so I'm not going to put it in. And he says, Jesus, David, if that's let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to lose the Book of the Month Club. You're going to lose the Reader's Digest deal. You're going to lose the Sunday Times contract in England. You're going to lose any chance of doing a paperback or softback publication in the United States because all the 7 biggest publishing houses, the paperback publishing houses in the United States who publish paperbacks, the 7 biggest are all Jewish. And they're not going to you can forget about doing a contract. You're talking about losing $1 million. And in a rather cavalier fashion, I said, Max, what you haven't had, you don't miss. But he got 10%, of course, of that, what I hadn't had. And he wasn't happy about that at all. And he said, David, I said, I can't, there's no evidence. He said, for God's sake, David, if you can't find the evidence, do what the others do, invent the evidence. I remember him very clearly saying that. That's one thing I remember very clearly. And the other thing I remember very clearly was the day when it came for the Viking press to publish this book. And a few weeks beforehand, we had a meeting with all their sales staff. All the Viking press's leading sales representatives came from all over the country, right across the Union. They came to New York, and I had to address them. This happens in publishing houses. They have 5 or 6 of their leading authors with the new books of that year that are going to be published. And you get up on the stage and you talk to the sales representatives. They sit in front of you and you tell them what's new about this book. And as I went on the stage, the sales manager of the Viking press came up to me and he took me by the arm and said, Dave, we've got a bit of a problem. We've got a bit of a problem with your book, Hitler's War. He says, I don't know how to put this to you, but this problem will be solved instantly if you can give me the right answer to the following question. Are you Jewish? It's the kind of question that means nothing to you at the time. But over the years that followed, that was 1975, 20 years have passed since then, that little question has kept on coming back into my mind. I had to say, I'm not Jewish. His face fell. He knew they had a problem. And I felt sorry for him, but there was nothing I could do about it. If I was called Irving David, I suppose he might have had a chance. But being called David Irving, everything was just the wrong way around for them. So that book has been in trouble ever since. A few years ago, I was interviewed by somebody in Time magazine, and he said, you know, before I had this lunch date with you today, Irving, I went and had a look in our clippings library to get up all the old clippings about you. And I'll tell you an odd thing I've noticed. Until you published your book, Hitler's War, in 1975, you couldn't put a foot wrong. You got whole-page reviews in Newsweek and Time magazine. You got wonderful press coverage of everything you did. And then suddenly, everything turned sour. And I said, tell me about it. I've noticed that fact myself. But it's interesting because when you're standing in the eye of the storm and you see it all happening to you, and over the later years you see the campaigns, you see the international campaign of vilification, you find yourself sitting on a plane in handcuffs being thrown out of a country that you've been visiting quite harmlessly for 30 years. You find bookshops' windows being smashed in. You must be doing something right. You must be doing something right, otherwise you as an individual citizen, why else would all these people be getting so mad as hell at you? And the answer is that for 30 years I've worked in the archives and people believe what I say. My voice carries a certain authority. I give evidence in court hearings in Canada, for example, against Ernst Zundel. I was called for the defense, and the judge afterwards said in private to the other lawyers he had never seen a witness who was as compelling as this English historian, because I had the answers. They would show documents on the screen which I'd never seen in my life before, and the prosecution counsel would believe straight away, we have the, rather like the O.J. Simpson case. Mr. Irving, how do you explain that document? Here is the chief of the SS talking about gas chambers in a document, a letter written to Himmler. And I would say straight away, but look again at that letter. It has no security classification on it. If they were talking about the final solution, which was the most, as you yourself say, the most secret of all the Nazi operations, this document would have a security classification on it. It would be stamped with secret or top secret. In German, Geheime Kommandosache or Geheime Reichssache. And if it hasn't got the rubber stamp, it would at least have those initials after the registration number of the letter, GRS or GKDOS, Geheime Kommandosache. And the fact that it hasn't got that security classification means that this document is of what I would call janitorial level. Literally. A perfectly innocent explanation as to why these sinister words like gas chamber come into a German document is because, in fact, it turned out to be part of the coking process for generating the necessary high-temperature gases that were used in the crematoria. So, what am I saying? Well, the first thing I say is I came in through the back door, so to speak, when I was writing the Adolf Hitler book, and it occurred to me that nowhere in any of the archives did I find one single document linking Hitler with what is now called the Holocaust. Notice the word that I say is now called the Holocaust. If you look in the newspapers before about 1970, you won't find that word. It's a modern word. It's a modern word. It's been generated by the Holocaust lobby because they know how to sell something. They're selling a package. It's got a capital H like Tylenol, capital T. They're selling a word and a concept. And that word Holocaust is the first word I'm going to impress on you as being something you should be very suspicious of. You're invited not to open the package, please. Like a package of Tylenol. Please don't touch the package. You have to buy the whole package without inspecting it. And anybody who does want to open that package and inspect it is then called something else, and this is the second word, Holocaust denier. Isn't that absurd? How can anyone deny the Holocaust? We've seen the pictures. We've heard the eyewitnesses. Holocaust denier. There's nothing more absurd, nothing more worthy of repugnance than the Holocaust denier, capital H, capital D. Not somebody who questions the Holocaust or somebody who is a skeptic, as I am. Bits of the story are undoubtedly true. Let me say this right from the start. There's no doubt at all, and particularly the young members of the audience here should realize this, there's no doubt at all that the Nazis in their 12-year rule inflicted nameless horrors on large segments of the population, including the Jews and other people whom they disliked. There's no doubt about that at all. What I do question are the methods. Was it done on a methodical scale? Was it done as a measure of the German state? If the Nazis massacred the Jews on any enormous scale, was it done on the orders of Adolf Hitler himself, in other words, the man who the German people had elected as their head of state? Or was it something that just happened? Was it premeditated, to use O.J. Simpson terminology? Or was it second-degree murder? I mean, these are the phrases we all know now, if you've all been sitting in front of our televisions. Was it premeditated, or was it second-degree murder? Was it all planned from the moment Hitler came to power, or did it just happen because war broke out, and because the Germans saw that we allies, the British and the Americans, were burning alive hundreds of thousands of their people every night, and the Germans wanted to hit back at someone, and it's human nature to hit back at somebody who's in your power. If you want to see what it looks like when 100,000 people are being burned alive, here's a picture of it, incidentally. There, that picture there. Not 100,000, actually, it's 40,000 people in the little German town of Pforzheim. None of you have heard of that. You've heard of Dresden and Hiroshima, but Pforzheim, that was 10 days after Dresden, being burned alive. 40,000 people in 20 minutes in the moment that photograph is taken by one of our airmen from the air. Burned alive, barbecued, because they were not the wrong colour, not because they were the wrong race, but because they were Germans. They were living on the wrong side of a frontier. And if I can divert here for a moment, I would say that if a crime was committed during World War II by any side, and I'm very open-minded about crimes being committed by all sides, I don't think the crime was genocide. This is the other word to watch for. Remember, we've got three words now: Holocaust, Holocaust denier, and genocide. The crime wasn't genocide. It's a word I make up, innocenticide. The killing of innocent people in war. That is the crime. If the Jews were killed in Auschwitz or Treblinka or anywhere else, and we'll look at that particular statement in a minute, it wasn't a crime because they were Jews, it was a crime because they were innocent Jews who were being killed. It was their innocence that made them a crime, made it a crime, and not their Jewishness that made it a crime. But the Jewish community today don't want that. That's why they've invented the third word, genocide, the killing of a race, because that's what they make money out of. If you enlarge the concept into the crime being the killing of any innocent people, then all sorts of people can qualify, please. The citizens of Coventry, the citizens of Nagasaki or Hiroshima, the American airmen who suffered when they were shot down and held in captivity, the Australians who were held in Japanese prison camps, all sorts of people suffered nameless horrors during World War II, innocent people. The people in this photograph, they suffered, but they haven't been able to claim a bent nickel for being burned alive. But this is it, you see. The word genocide is a very useful word because it limits the concept of who is entitled to the money, please. Only people who have been killed because of their race. But it wasn't their race that made it into a crime, it was their innocence that made it into a crime. So those are the three words that are used in the propaganda that surrounds the Holocaust campaign today. And it's big money. Big money is involved in this. The American taxpayer, I'm quite sure you're doing this willingly, are donating between $3 and $4 billion a year to the state of Israel, and you do it willingly because you are guilty. And your guilt is brought home to you again and again as Christian human beings by television programs which bring it home to you in a subliminal way that you are guilty of the Holocaust in some way, because you are the same religion and the same race as the Germans who carried out this Holocaust crime. And so you pay the money and you don't complain. And if anyone was to stand up and complain about the $3 or $4 billion going that way, he would be instantly accused of being anti-Semitic. And the Germans are paying $1 billion, just under $1 billion in reparations and restitution for the same reason. $5 billion a year going that way, upon which that state depends. And you begin to understand why they don't like me when I come along and say, I've got no axe to grind, which is true. I'm not Jewish, I'm not anti-Jewish, I'm not anti-Semitic, despite everything they've done to me, but I am a truthful historian, and I'm going to ask certain questions. First question is, if they killed 4 million people in Auschwitz concentration camp, this was the original figure. Since we revisionists, as we're called, began campaigning about this 4 or 5 years ago, suddenly the 4 million figure has been abandoned, and it's now only 1 million. It's extraordinary. They wiped off 3 million off that figure in Auschwitz, and yet the overall figure of 6 million hasn't changed. I don't understand the mathematics. I'm sure somewhere buried deep in the Talmud is a strange kind of mathematical equation which explains how you can take off 3 million and still end up with 6 million, the original figure they started off with. It's like one of those quiz show questions. But it's, believe me, ladies and gentlemen, it's a lot less than 1 million in Auschwitz. And I'm not going to say it was only 100,000 Jews who were killed in Auschwitz, because if even one Jew is murdered, that's a crime. But what I am going to say is what did happen and what didn't happen. And I'm only going to deal with Auschwitz because that basically is the capital ship of the whole of the Holocaust campaign. If Auschwitz sinks, and it is, believe me, a very lethal vessel indeed now, if Auschwitz sinks without trace, then the whole of the Holocaust campaign is in doubt and open to skepticism, to healthy skepticism, not to vicious, malignant skepticism which anti-Semites might like, but to the kind of healthy skepticism which any ordinary citizen is invited to show to any subject, whether it's the assassination of JFK or the O.J. Simpson case or any other event which bulks large on our historical horizon. If they murdered 1 million people in Auschwitz using poison gas, why is there no trace of that gas in the buildings of Auschwitz today? This is the first question. And it's a very interesting question because it never occurs to people. It never occurred to me, I have to admit it, that you should carry out the same kind of tests on a building that you carry out on documents as a historian. You remember when the Adolf Hitler diaries first surfaced in 1983. A man in Germany claimed to have found Adolf Hitler's private diaries, and he earned $9 million from a foolish German magazine to whom he supplied these diaries at the rate of one a week because that's how long it took him to write them, this man. And I was the person who exposed those diaries as being fake at that magazine's press conference in April 1983. But it's the obvious things that you don't spot. I said, carry out the tests on the paper, test the ink. When you write with ink, fountain pen ink, the ink begins to oxidize the moment it hits the air, and a good laboratory can tell you, a good forensic police laboratory can tell you how old a signature is. Above all, they can tell you if the ink is ballpoint ink or regular ink, fountain pen ink. And I said, test the ink, test the paper, test the glue, test the string. You can do all these. Well, I mean, you've been watching the television the last few weeks anyway, so you know what laboratories can do when they want to age something and test the age of something. But what didn't occur to me was the fact that Adolf Hitler's diaries were stacked up on front of us in that press conference, 72 of them, written by this man, as it turned out, not by Adolf Hitler, but by this forger. And these 72 diaries were all written in identical leather notebooks. Rather cheap leather notebooks. That meant that that man, Adolf Hitler, back in about 1922, had gone into his local Barnes & Noble and said, I want 72 of those diaries, please, I'm going to write a diary. And of course it isn't like that. And it never occurred to me, it never occurred to anyone that diaries extending over the last 20 or 30 years are higgledy-piggledy. They come in all sorts of shapes and colours and sizes because that's the way you buy them year by year. It's the obvious things you overlook. And none of us historians thought of demanding that there should be tests carried out on the fabric of the gas chambers at Auschwitz. The buildings survive partly. They're in ruins, some of them, others are more or less intact. And eventually, in 1988, as part of this Canadian trial that I mentioned, the case against Ernst Zundel, the defense lawyers decided to send an expert in gas chambers over to Auschwitz. An expert in gas chambers. Well, you're only going to find that in the United States, of course, because only the United States gases people are present. So this expert in gas chambers, a man called Fred Leuchter, was sent over to Auschwitz to test the gas chambers of the Nazi concentration camp. Would these gas chambers work? Is there any trace of their having been used as gas chambers? Is there any residue of cyanide gas in the walls? All the obvious questions. And he came back and he wrote an affidavit for the court, which we eventually published as the Leuchter Report. Photographs of the buildings, photographs of the brickwork, photographs, the actual tests, the chemical tests carried out, the forensic tests carried out on the 48 samples that he brought back to the United States, bits of brickwork that he took out of the walls and submitted to the forensic laboratories in Cornell University to have tests carried out. And the result was that in 47 of the 48 samples, there wasn't the slightest significant trace of cyanide compound. In the 48th sample, there were colossal traces of cyanide, 141 milligrams of hydrogen cyanide or ferric ferrocyanide in every kilogram of brickwork. And what is the explanation of that result? Well, the answer is in that sample he had taken out of a little gas chamber that was used for disinfesting clothing, killing the lice and the vermin in the prisoners' clothing. The clothing was stuffed into this little gas chamber which looked like a gas chamber. It had got a steel door with a peephole and ventilation systems and racks rather like a dry cleaners for wheeling the clothing in and out. And he took that sample out of that brickwork, and that's where the colossal cyanide was found. It's significant because all our opponents have said you don't expect to find cyanide in the brickwork after 50 years. How absurd, how ludicrous. After 50 years of wind and rain, you're not going to find cyanide compounds, residue of a gas in the brickwork. And the answer is you do. And the proof of that answer is, first of all, they did find the residue in that little gas chamber. In fact, the walls of that little gas chamber were so soaked in cyanide compounds that they had turned blue. Got photographs of it here, of what those blue walls look like. You can see here. Color photographs of the little gas chamber in Auschwitz, showing the blue stain on the walls where the cyanide has seeped through the brickwork, forming a compound called ferric ferrocyanide, which is otherwise known by the trade name of Prussian blue. It becomes so permanent it's actually used as a dyestuff. Prussian blue, or Berliner Blau. And when this was denied, a brave German scientist called Germar Rudolph, and this is a sad story with an unhappy ending. Young Germar Rudolph, a young 28-year-old German chemist, a research chemist working at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. The Max Planck Institute is one of the most prestigious bodies with the kind of reputation of the National Institutes of Health here in Bethesda, Maryland. He decided to write his dissertation on that one subject, the permanence of cyanide compounds in brickwork. And having written his dissertation, he then allowed it to be circulated in printed form to 2,000 German chemists, professors of chemistry at universities, who confirmed that what he had written was true. Too late, the traditional enemy spotted what he did, and they had him dismissed from his position at the Max Planck Institute. The letters have now been published where they put pressure on the Max Planck Institute for him to be dismissed. And 1 month ago, young Germar Rudolph was sentenced by the German government to 14 months in prison for allowing his scientific report, his dissertation, to be published under the German laws for the suppression of free speech. He had infringed against those laws, and he's now been sent to prison for 14 months for allowing his chemical results to be circulated to the professors of chemistry and physics in Germany. It's a horrifying thought. It's all as though the wheel is coming full circle. The Germans don't realize themselves, unfortunately, those who live in Germany, because they've lived under oppressive regimes for so long, since the beginning of this century. They didn't realize, but think about it in the United States. If a research chemist in the United States had published a report and then found himself being prosecuted because his scientific report came up with politically unacceptable conclusions. That's what's happening in Germany every day. I have been fined by the German government $22,000 for saying one sentence in a meeting like this in Munich. And the sentence that I said was, the gas chamber in Auschwitz, which they showed to the tourists, was built by the Polish government after the war. I said that at a meeting on April the 21st, 1991, and I was fined $22,000 for making that one remark as a historian to a conference like this. Imagine that happening in the United States, a $22,000 fine for giving an expert opinion, where one is open to being shot down, where anybody can stand up in discussion time and say, Irving, you're talking through your hat, the facts are obviously as follows. But no, they protect the legend with $22,000 fines in my case, and with being sent to prison for 14 months in the case of Dr. Germar Rudolph. This tells us something about the quality of the legend that they're trying to protect, I think. And what about that statement that I made? The gas chamber they show the tourists in Auschwitz is a fake, built by the Poles after the war. I said that in 1991. In the court hearings, I applied to call the director of the Auschwitz State Museum as a witness, knowing that he would confirm what I said. The court would not allow us to call any witnesses or to produce any documents in our defense. They said, under German law, it is an established fact that that was a gas chamber and you are not allowed to question it. You have committed an offense. Fine $22,000, 30,000 Deutschmarks. The amusing thing is that the biggest French magazine, L'Express, which is very similar to Newsweek or Time, the biggest French news magazine, L'Express, on January the 26th this year, published a 12-page investigation of Auschwitz on the anniversary of the camp's liberation. And they came to exactly the same conclusion. This prestigious French author, he wrote in French that he had discussed with the director of the Auschwitz Museum and with the deputy director of the Auschwitz Museum, a woman, the artifacts that they showed to the public, and he had come to the conclusion that 60% of what is now on display in Auschwitz is fake, and that in particular the gas chamber that they showed to the tourists was never used as a gas chamber, and that the Auschwitz Museum authorities have confirmed to him that it was built in 1948 3 years after the war by the Polish communists as a display exhibit, and is totally fraudulent. To use his own words, tout y est faux. Everything in it is false. So I've written to the German government, and 20,000 of my friends around the world have written the same letter to the German government, to ambassadors, consuls general, journalists in Pretoria and Melbourne and Canberra and everywhere around the world. 20,000 letters saying, if L'Express has written that in January this year, is it true or is it false? If it is true that that gas chamber is a fake, built by the Poles after the war, is it now permitted to say so in Germany, or is it still a criminal offence? If it is permitted to say so, then why was David Irving fined $22,000? If it's still a criminal offence, then why haven't you prosecuted the French magazine which was on sale in Germany? And the replies that have come from the German government before the German government in Bonn issued a central directive to all its ambassadors around the world not to reply to this letter, again an interesting admission of defeat. The replies are truly illuminating and in fact hilarious. What other evidence do we have that the Holocaust legend is leaking? Well, there are no documents. Not one single page of German wartime documents talks about gas chambers or killing people with gas. And there are people who say, but Irving, you don't expect to find any documents. The Nazis will have destroyed everything in the last weeks of the war. Well, somebody who says that is unfamiliar with the kind of chaos that exists even now in the German archives. If you go to the National Archives in Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington and see the captured German records there, they're still in disarray. The Germans, in the final weeks of chaos, would not have had time to meticulously go through every single file and folder and document, removing every document, because even if every carbon copy at Hitler's headquarters had been preserved and saved and rescued from Hitler's headquarters in Poland before the Russians arrived there, the person at the receiving end of those orders would have received it too through the teleprinter, and he would have made copies. And even if every copy of that had been destroyed, there's always some Feldfebel, some corporal who writes a private diary, or who writes a letter home to Mummy in which he describes what they did that day. And those documents have turned up now in profusion, but there's nowhere in the private diaries or private letters of the Germans during those years, not a single reference explicitly to killing people in gas chambers. There's lots of references to ugly things being done to the Jews, but the gas chambers just don't survive in the archives. And this I find significant, because I've worked in the archives, and I know what to expect and what not to expect. And I would expect to have found that by now, 50 years after. And about 20 years ago, I, with a $1,000 bundle of notes, and come up with one single wartime document. I did it to Deborah Lipstadt in Atlanta a few weeks ago, who's my arch enemy here in the United States. I stood up at the back of her audience, where she had delivered a speech in which she had made mincemeat of me, not knowing I was sitting in the back row. And I said, you've quoted this, and you've said you've obtained blueprints and documents of gas chambers from the Moscow archives. Here's $1,000, Mrs. Lipstadt, if you can show the audience now that blueprint you just talked about. Because you can't. You know you've lied. They've lied. And she eventually called the police to have me thrown out of the meeting. That's the only way they operate. Only people will say, not the proof that the documents didn't exist. The Germans managed to destroy every single document. They couldn't have destroyed the documents that we British had. Now, you won't know this, but 1942 and 1943, the middle years of the war, we British had developed a computer which was reading the German codes. And in those 2 years, 1942 and 1943, we had developed that computer to break the codes of Himmler and the SS. And in particular, we were reading every day the messages of the concentration camp commandants of the 7 biggest concentration camps, including Dachau and Buchenwald and Auschwitz. And what do these signals say that Auschwitz is sending back to Berlin every day that we were reading without the Germans knowing it? Remember, they're sending this in their top secret code, so they're not concealing anything. They're sending it in their own secret code, and they have no reason to believe that we British have a computer, which didn't exist in those days, but we built the first ever computer in the world. It was as big as a house. And we were breaking the German codes with it. And the SS codes, the commandant of Auschwitz, a man called Rudolf Höss, was reporting back to Berlin every day what he was doing in his camp. And he was giving statistics, 4 figures every day. The numbers of prisoners who had arrived during the previous 24 hours ending at midnight. The number of prisoners, or slave laborers, if you will, who had left the camp during the previous 24 hours. The numbers of prisoners who were on hand at midnight, the total in the camp at Auschwitz. And the 4th figure was losses, Abgänger. which was correctly interpreted by British intelligence as meaning the number of prisoners who had died during the previous 24 hours in Auschwitz. A minuscule figure, which was again broken down into three categories. The number of prisoners who had died from epidemics and illness, the numbers of prisoners who had died from shooting, and the number of prisoners who had died from hanging. The British official historian, Professor Sir Frank Hinsley, the master of St. John's College in Cambridge University now, the British Secret Service, who revealed these facts in an appendix to Volume 2, you can get it in your local library probably at your university, of the history of the British Secret Service. He says, on analysing these Auschwitz daily telegrams, that there's no doubt that most of the deaths in Auschwitz occurred through natural causes, if you can call them natural causes in a slave labour camp. Typhus in particular, starvation, hunger, overwork, old age. By far the smallest number of deaths was caused by executions, he writes. Now that is an academic historian who I trust. He has no axe to grind one way or the other. He's just reporting what he finds in this unusual source of information, the secret reports of the camp commandant himself, written in a secret code which he thought nobody else was reading but himself and the chief of the SS. Why should he conceal if he was killing hundreds of thousands of Jews every day, as is now said? How many Jews is he supposed to have killed every day? Well, the figures, you've read them, 50 or 60,000 a day he was killing. But we run up against another problem there, ladies and gentlemen, because if you're killing 50 or 60,000 people a day, be they Jews or anybody else, and if you're cremating 50 or 60,000 people a day, you need the capacity to cremate that number of people. And that's where the statistics break down, because we know exactly how many crematoria they had at Auschwitz. They had a large number. They had 5 or 6 buildings there, which weren't all operating together, but still quite a large number. And we know that if these crematoria were working throughout the period the camp was in operation, they could, working flat out, have cremated about 60 or 70,000 bodies. It's an ugly subject, but we're getting now to final totals. And we've got another figure which kicks in here, because if you're cremating 60,000 people a day, you're going to need a huge quantity of coke. We know, and any crematorium expert or manager here in downtown Cincinnati will confirm this, that if you've got a coke-operated crematorium, it takes 30 or 40 or 50 kilograms of coke for each cadaver. So you're looking at a huge quantity of coke being required every day for these figures you read about in the newspapers now, about 2,000 tons of coke a day. But we have aerial photographs of Auschwitz that were taken during the war, taken by American and British and South African planes. Photographs that are so detailed, I have them with me. Photographs that are so detailed you can see the people walking around in the streets of the camp. There's no signs of huge quantities of coke, no mountains of coke, there are no huge mass graves either, no pits, no lines of people waiting outside the gas chambers. All these legends begin to dissolve when you look at these photographs under a magnifying glass. We can be very precise about the coke, in fact, because in the Russian archives, which has now become available, where I've worked too in Moscow, the secret archives of the Soviet Union, they found the entire operating documents of the Auschwitz concentration camp, including the quantities of coke that were supplied for the crematoria throughout the entire period. It's a figure worth making a mental note of. 2,188 tons of coke were supplied to Auschwitz from start to finish, which is enough to cremate 70 or 80,000 bodies again. So you're coming roughly to a figure of about 100,000 bodies, which is again confirmed, oddly enough, by the Russians who released to the Western powers 4 years ago the death books of Auschwitz, which contain all the death certificates of everyone who died in Auschwitz. 46 bound volumes of death certificates with a total of 66,000 names. So again, you've got an order of magnitude of how many people died. And if most of those people died of natural causes and a fraction died of being executed or murder or brutality, this is still a crime, I'm not denying that. But we then come to a point which I mentioned earlier, the innocenticide factor comes in. Because if of those 100,000 people who died in Auschwitz, even a quarter were murdered, 25,000. Remember the picture I showed you here? On the one hand, 25,000 people being murdered in Auschwitz over the entire war years, and on the other hand, 40,000 people being burned alive in 20 minutes. The whole world talks about the one crime, endless television movies are made about it, you're all made to feel guilty about it, The other crime is swept under the carpet as though it never happened. And when a British historian comes along and repeatedly talks about it, he's the one who finds himself being put in handcuffs and deported and hounded around the world and finding doors slammed in his face from Pretoria to Vancouver. It gives food for thought. I've only mentioned in this brief talk a very few of the facts which point in the direction that I'm telling the truth. I know of no one document which operates in the other direction. I've got a lot of documents which show the Germans were very brutal. I've got a lot of documents which show the Germans massacring people on the Eastern Front. I'm not going to gainsay that for one moment. It's a question of orders of magnitude, of relativity between the crimes on the one hand and the crimes on the other. And if there's one word which is engraven on my shield as a historian, it's not just the word truth or justice, but even-handedness. I think that the time has come, 50 years after the war, to see an even-handedness. I boil with rage at the hypocrisy of other writers and other historians. I have to boil with rage at the hypocrisy of your own government sometimes. I boiled with rage at the time of the Oklahoma bombing earlier this year. And I think to myself, how many Oklahomas did your government fire at Baghdad during the Gulf War? How many Oklahomas of your citizens in the northern states financed in Northern Ireland, for example, paid for the benefit of Mr. Jerry Allen, who now comes in and out of the White House? This is the kind of hypocrisy which irritates me. I like to be able to stand back and say, if this is a crime, then that was a crime. And no one is going to tell me, David Irving, to shut up, even if they bankrupt me. It began with my agent telling me all those years ago, if you don't put those 15 pages in that book, you're going to lose $1 million in royalties over the next 10 years. And I said, forget the $1 million in royalties. I want to write a book that's going to stand up by itself and go down in history as the one that people quote. And my family don't understand me. I know this, and a lot of people don't understand me. My publishers don't understand me, but I can sleep easy at night. I have no fear of ever being exposed as a fraud. I have no fear that someone is going to come along and say, we've got a document that proves you wrong. And oh well, suppose they do find a document that proves me wrong. I'm not going to drop it on the floor and sweep it under the carpet and pretend it doesn't exist. I'm not going to call for that man to be locked up. I'm going to shrug my shoulders and say, well, for 30 years I've given you a run for your money. I thought I was right. You've proved me wrong. Well done. But they're not going to succeed. I've got an instinct which tells me that the truth is on my side in this particular fight. It's an interesting battle, ladies and gentlemen, but I have so many friends around the world that I'm convinced that I'm going to win it. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Just in conclusion, I mentioned one little example of my open-mindedness. The man who took the color photographs, which are in the Hitler biography, is a photographer called Walter Frenz. He's still alive. Eventually, when I got to know him very well, he showed me his collection of 3,000 color transparencies that he took when he was on Adolf Hitler's staff as a film cameraman. In fact, there's a picture of him earlier in the book with his film camera taking a picture. Beautiful photographs, and I used to go and visit him at Lake Constance, which is near Switzerland, as you know. And we would talk far into the night, and eventually he would describe to me how he saw a mass execution going on. Himmler, the chief of the SS, came up to him and said, Herr Frenz, it's boring here in Hitler's headquarters, isn't it? You want to go on an outing with me? Frenz said, sure. And Himmler says, well, we're off to the Eastern Front for 3 days. And for 3 days, they toured the Russian front, visiting SS units and police units. And Frenz has told me the same story over the last 15 years, 2 or 3 times, and he adds more and more details each time he tells me, you know, the way the memory remembers things that he didn't really want to say before. And he said one evening as we're drinking, Himmler says to me, Herr Frenz, tomorrow morning I'm going to go and witness a mass execution. Do you want to come along? Now, I've got to admit, this is where the German mentality and the English mentality obviously diverge. If somebody said to me, Mr. Irving, tomorrow I'm going to go and witness a mass execution, do you want to come along? I would find something else to do that morning, believe me. I'd look at my watch, I'd say, well, my timetable was rather crowded. Thanks for the invitation, but can I give a rain check on him? Frenz said, clicked his heels and said, Herr Reichsführer, I'll be delighted to come along. And he finds himself at 7 or 8 next morning standing on the edge of a field, the way you've imagined it. A large, windswept, desolate field somewhere outside Minsk. It was August 1941. We've located it now. We know exactly what day it was. watching as truckloads of civilians were driven up to pits on the far side of the field, being unloaded from these trucks, forced to line up, forced to take off all their valuable clothes and their valuables and put them in boxes and then stand up in a line against the edge of a pit and be machine gunned into this pit. And he watches it for an hour. And he describes various other he's telling me the story at 2 o'clock in the morning over a bottle of rather fine wine, and his wife, who's listening, round-eyed, this is back in about 1980, 1975, she says, "Walter, you never told me this." And he's rather embarrassed. He's obviously, the Germans say, vergaloppiert. He's let his mouth, he's running off his mouth a bit. And his wife says, "Walter, were there women and children there being killed as well?" And he says, "I can't remember." And you know he can remember. You see, I got these people to talk to me. Hitler's private secretary, a dear old lady who died 10 years ago, she was his secretary for 12 years, from 1933 until 1 week before he committed suicide. She was with him in the bunker in Berlin, Christa Schröder. She became so close to me as I worked on her that she actually gave me the only self-portrait that Hitler sketched of himself. I have it in the car outside, a very valuable piece of paper. She said, "You know, Herr Irving, I think you're wrong about Hitler and the Jews." This is again at like 3 in the morning, a conversation over tea or wine. "I think you're wrong about the chief," she called him, the chief, and the Jews. Or AH, she called him AH as well. AH could be very cruel. And knowing the way with Christa Schröder to get her to talk was to play her like a fish, not to tug, but just reel out a bit of line. I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "I was with him on the night of the long knives." Now, the night of the long knives in history was in June 1934, a year after Hitler came to power, when he decided to liquidate all his senior rivals in the Nazi party, the brown shirts, Ernst Röhm and a dozen others. In fact, it was 84 people who were finally murdered that night. She said, "I was in Berlin and I got a telephone call from AH. He wanted me to fly straight over to join him in Bad Godesberg. He needed me. He needed the secretaries not to dictate to, but he needed them to talk to. He needed human company." And they flew down that night from the Rhine city of Bad Godesberg down to Munich, and they climbed into those big Mercedes open limousines and drove out to a town on the outskirts of Munich. She described all this. She said she was with him when he went into the hotel. He arrested all his rivals, had them taken away by the SS, and they were shot later that day in the prison at Stadelheim, just lined up against a wall and shot. It was the first bloody massacre of the Nazi regime. And she said later on that afternoon they flew back to Berlin, and Hitler was obviously exhausted by the day's events. When they got back to Berlin, the German capital, Hitler vanished into his chancellery, into his building, like the White House. He vanished into his chancellery and she didn't see him for an hour. And she said, "Mr. Irving, I went down into the cafeteria by myself and I ordered dinner. The chief and I, we were both vegetarians, and I knew he'd eventually come down. And after about an hour, he showed up and he stood in the door, buttoning up his jacket, and he said, 'So, Fräulein Schröder, now I have had a bath and I feel as clean as a newborn babe again.'" She told me that, I suppose, 15 years ago. 40 years probably had passed since she heard him say those words. She'd never spoken them to anybody else, but those words had drifted around in her memory for 40 years, and she had longed to tell somebody this telling sentence, what the chief had said to her after killing his closest friends and rivals. "I've had a bath and I'm as clean as a newborn babe again." A sentence that really says it all about him, and about quite a lot of people. You get the impression that O.J. Simpson had a bath and felt as clean as a newborn babe. Not that I want to prejudge his guilt, but there we are. We'll have a 15-minute break, ladies and gentlemen, and then those of you who have stammered will have a discussion afterwards. There's coffee at the back. Thank you. Is there not also a parallel not only between the crimes that the Allies committed as such and the crimes that the Nazis committed? I didn't mention the Soviet Union, of course. Well, the Soviet Union was one of the Allies, but I suppose the statistics are so enormous that people don't seem to be able to grasp them. The number of people who died under Stalin's rule of terror. I remember when I was very, very small, at that age when you start standing up on your hind legs and groping along the bookshelves of your father's books, finding a book called The Red Terror, and a book next to it in the bookshelves called The Cheka. And these were two books about the the Russian secret police and how they dealt with their opponents in the years after World War I and after the October Revolution. And I devoured them, those books, and they left indelible pictures impregnated on my mind of massacre and of murder and of atrocity, horrifying pictures. I mean, I've got some word images still engraved on my mind just from reading those two books. And then when I married a Spanish woman in 1959, we then found out a great deal about how the communists had behaved in the Spanish Civil War, including coming to take away her father and execute him in the courtyard, but they got the wrong one by mistake, and they took his brother away and executed him instead. And so I was brought up in the right school. I knew everything that the communists had done. And one book I wrote in about 1975 was, as Rick mentioned, the history of the Hungarian uprising of 1956 against the communist occupation of Hungary, for which I had access to a certain number of CIA files, which were very interesting because the CIA carried out in-depth psychological interrogations of a large number of the Hungarian refugees who came to this country after 1956. And there was no doubt in my mind a very interesting discovery indeed, which I wasn't aware of until I began investigating that. I didn't realize this. The reason I began writing a book about the Hungarian uprising was entirely irrelevant. I decided to write a book about something other than Hitler and the Third Reich, just to show that I wasn't in a rut. But the odd thing was that when I began writing that book, I discovered from the CIA files that the Hungarian people, when they started that uprising, it began as an anti-Jewish pogrom. It was essentially an anti-Jewish revolution and not an anti-communist revolution to begin with for the first few days. The Hungarian people regarded their government in the 1950s as being a Jewish government. And they regarded the secret police, the dreaded Államvédelmi Hatóság, the AVH, as being a Jewish secret police. And essentially it was, because when the Red Army entered Hungary in 1945, they brought back into Hungary all the Jews who had taken refuge in the Soviet Union. And they were the ones who got the plum jobs, and they were the ones who got the trustworthy jobs as secret police chiefs and as torturers. And that's why the Jews were so hated in Hungary by 1956, because they were regarded as the people who had inflicted this nameless misery on the Hungarian people. And so the uprising began as an anti-Jewish uprising. Every one of the Hungarian leaders at that time in 1956, Rákosi and Farkas and Gero and the rest of the Hungarian leaders, they were all Jews. And I never realized that when I set out to write it. It's an extraordinary fact, the way these things are kept away from the public consciousness. And, of course, inevitably, when the book came out, I was accused of anti-Semitism for having written it. But what am I supposed to do when you discover something as a historian? Are you supposed to try and pretend it isn't that? And if you do pretend it isn't that, you're doing the Jewish people more harm than good, I think. I delivered a lecture in Shreveport, in Louisiana, about 6 months ago, and on this occasion the audience was about as large as this, but half the audience had been taken over by the local Jewish community, and they decided to wreck my meeting by barracking and by interrupting and by being thoroughly obnoxious. And after an hour of this, with the rest of the audience getting very restless at the way they were not being permitted to hear me deliver my lecture, I then said to the leader of the Jewish community who was attacking me, I said, it just came to me like this. I said, I look at myself in the mirror in the mornings and I know that I'm disliked. I've been called disliked by reviewers in England. The Sunday Times called me the most disliked historian in Britain, which caused me to write a letter to the Sunday Times saying, is it the historian's duty to be liked, therefore? And how do you know that I'm the most disliked historian in Britain? Do you stand in Oxford Street with a clipboard asking people, what do you think about historians? How do you rate David? And, oh, he's most disliked. I know, I said to this Jewish mob in my audience, that I am disliked, and I know why I'm disliked. Now, you people have been disliked for 3,000 years. Do you ever look in the mirror and ask yourselves why you are disliked? That might be very... No, I didn't mean it in an offensive way. I meant it as a helpful, self-analytical way, the way that the communists, the Marxist-Leninists are advised to self-criticize and self-analyze. Have you ever analyzed yourselves as a race and said to yourselves, we have been hounded and persecuted and harried and massacred for 3,000 years, why us? And they never ask themselves that question, do they? They never asked them this. They come along and they harry and persecute others, and they behave in a thoroughly obnoxious way, as I probably behave in their eyes. But they never ask themselves why, and they never cure their own faults. One of the leader of this faction in the audience stood up furiously. From his accent, I could tell not only that he came from England, but from London, and from his accent, in fact, I could tell from which corner of London he came from, because England, our accents are like that. We're very class-conscious in England. We can tell what class somebody is by their accent, and we can tell which street almost they come from. If you've seen My Fair Lady, you'll know this. And I said, you come from Colindale, don't you? And he said, how do you know that? I said, your accent gives you away. And he was the leader of the gang. And he said, are you accusing us? Are you saying that we are responsible for Auschwitz ourselves? And it's a bit of a dazzling question, and when you think about it, I said, well, the short answer is yes. But that's a cruel answer, because to do the question justice, you've got to have a lot of intervening stages, of course. But the short answer, if you want to hop from A to Z, is yes. If you hadn't behaved the way you have as a race for 3,000 years, first the Russians, then the Poles, then the Galicians, then the Austrians, and the rest wouldn't have harried and hounded you from pillar to post, so you end up finding yourselves in Auschwitz. And you've never asked yourselves why. And they still don't want to accept that. To him, that question and my answer was unacceptable. In Germany, it would no doubt have been grounds for another $22,000 fine. In Canada, I would have probably found myself in handcuffs again. But I don't think it was an anti-Semitic answer. It was an attempt to be helpful in a kind of psychiatrist couch way. Analyze yourself. Cast out the mote from thine own eye. Yes. A question, yes.
I'm very interested in the DEF camps and Operation Keelhaul. Do you have a great deal of knowledge on that? Or?
Operation Keelhaul. You're going to have to remind me what Operation Keelhaul was. I know the code word, but...
That was the repatriation of the Russian citizens.
Oh, yes, that's right. Tolstoy. Nicholas Tolstoy's book, and Harold Macmillan. At the end of World War II, there was a lot of tidying up to be done. A lot of people found themselves on the wrong sides of the frontiers. In British prison camps, we had large numbers of Russian soldiers in German uniforms who had fought on the German side. We had British soldiers in German uniforms. There were Yugoslavs who had fought against Yugoslav. There were people who found themselves on the wrong sides of the lines as they crystallized at the end of World War II. And the question arose what to do with these people. Well, Stalin had a certain leverage because he claimed to hold numbers of Allied prisoners or Allied troops on his side of the lines that he had found in German camps that had been overrun by the Red Army, and he made it known that he wasn't going to let them go home to the United States and Britain unless we turned over to the Soviet Union and to Yugoslavia the peoples that they wanted, like the Cossacks, like the Vlasov troops who had fought in, Russian troops who had fought on the German side. And so we took the ignominious step of hoping nobody would notice that we were quietly sweeping these people over the frontier into the Russian hands or into the hands of Marshal Tito, knowing that they were going to be liquidated as soon as they arrived. Harold Macmillan, who was at that time a relatively lowly officer in the British Army, was part of that operation. It's something that nobody can be proud of, but I think you have to show a certain degree of humanity for the people who took those cruel decisions, rotten decisions, and say that they had been misinformed and they were led to believe that by taking these ignominious steps they were saving the lives of British or American soldiers who were in Russian or Yugoslav hands. And also you have to take into account something which is too easily forgotten years later, and this is the climate of opinion at that time. When you wonder how a German soldier can point a machine gun at helpless women and children standing on the edge of a pit, you can't do it unless, if you regard it in vacuo. You can only begin to understand that man's mentality if you think yourself back to the climate of 1942 or 1943 and say to yourself, this man has probably been through the streets of Berlin or of Pforzheim or some other German town and seen what the Allies have done to his civilians, and a climate of brutality and barbarism arises. And that climate of brutality and barbarism doesn't suddenly end when the war ends, like switching off a TV set. It lingers over for months and for years later. It provides a climate which makes it possible to hold trials like the Nuremberg trial. It provides a climate which makes it possible even now, 50 years later, for Hollywood still to be churning out films of hatred against the Germans, although in their entire existence, the Nazi filmmakers made only 3 anti-Jewish films: the film Judzus, the film Der ewige Jude, the Eternal Jew, and a film about the Rothschilds. Only 3 films made by Dr. Goebbels and the Nazi film industry about the Jews, and yet Hollywood has retaliated with tens of thousands of anti-German films over the last 50 years because the climate of hatred is still lingering on. Yes? Yes.
After you research this thoroughly, and I know that you have, what is your best estimate of how many Jews were exterminated or terminated or killed by that?
What's my best estimate on how many Jews were exterminated or killed? It's an interesting question, and only recently, in the last month, the leading Jewish magazine in England, called Searchlight, which is a communist operation, has headlined an article saying David Irving now admits the Nazis killed 4 million Jews. And this is a misquotation of what I said on a live Australian radio broadcast 2 months ago, when Australian radio did a live interview with me, and the Australian radio asked me the same question. And I said, from all causes, during the entire period of the Nazi regime, from 1933 to 1945, I would estimate that up to 4 million Jews will have died from all causes, including air raids, starvation, epidemics, being worked to death, dying of natural causes, everything else. But this magazine turned it round as though I had now recanted and was saying that the Nazis had killed 4 million. To answer your question, if we look just at the case of Auschwitz, I think probably as many as 100,000 Jews died in Auschwitz, which was a brutal slave labor camp where they had no business to be. The fact that they died in that camp of natural causes, in quotation marks, epidemics, mostly typhus, is neither here nor there. Of those 100,000, probably about 10,000 were actually physically murdered in the criminal sense. The rest died, they fell by the wayside in Auschwitz. Machine gunned in the pits behind the Eastern Front. In Auschwitz, we're talking about primarily Western European Jews from Hungary, France, Holland, and the other countries where they were rounded up. And of course, it raises the logical question, if you're going to kill them, and you round them up in France and all these other countries, why ship them all the way across Europe and then kill them when they arrive? It doesn't make sense. It's a logical question. The Eastern European Jews, the Russian Jews, who were murdered in the pits, shot in the pits, you can do a few quantitative analyses there of how many people were killed and isolated. Don't believe the documents, because an SS Einsatzgruppencommander, a task force commander, writes a report to Berlin saying, we have in the last month murdered 360,000 Jews. Don't believe that. It was their duty to inflate figures. They wanted to create big figures. They wanted body counts, rather like the Vietnam War. So those figures are unreliable. In fact, that's been shown as early as the Manstein trial of the 1940s, when the defendant, the lawyers defending Field Marshal Manstein, examined these documents and said, here's this Einsatzkommando which claims to have killed 300,000 Jews in 1 month, and yet all they had was 30 men and 2 3-ton pickup trucks. How could they have transported all these people around? Obvious questions, you see. I think probably on the Eastern Front up to 200,000 or 300,000 Jews from Minsk and the other big cities will have been rounded up and liquidated. Not just by the Germans, primarily by the Ukrainians and by the native populations themselves, who had scores to settle. Again, this is politically incorrect to mention this. But in Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, in particular, the local population had bitter scores to settle with the Jews, because during the 1 year when those countries were occupied from 1940 to 1941 under the Hitler-Stalin Pact, they were occupied by the Soviet Union. The NKVD, which was the secret police, the forerunner of the KGB, had occupied those 3 countries with a reign of terror, and using largely Jewish officers, because the KGB or the NKVD was largely Jewish officers at that time, They had carried out a rule of liquidation and purge in those three countries, murdering hundreds of thousands of local middle-class entrepreneurs. The priests, the businessmen, the intellectuals were rounded up, driven off at dead of night by the communists, by these Jewish organizations, and murdered. And a year later, when Hitler's armies invaded and marched through these countries, they found the local population busy solving the Jewish problem for them, taking revenge. Nobody likes talking about that now, but if you read the records, particularly the German military records, where reports are coming to Hitler's headquarters saying, when we arrived in Riga, we found the local population busy exterminating the Jews. What shall we do? And from Hitler's headquarters, back goes a signal saying, don't interfere. Don't interfere. This is the true story of what happened, but it's an unpopular story. Yes?
Dr. Mark,
Yeah.
I'm a scholar at Irving College in Cincinnati. In the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1946, set the world Jewish population in Europe in 1938 to approximately 2.8 million people. And the number of people who left between 38 and 39, the number of people who survived by the declaration. With respect to Smith's war memory, is considerably excessive.
Yes. Well, you're quoting to me figures from the Encyclopedia Britannica. I'm repeating this for the benefit of the camera and for the audience. You're quoting figures from the Encyclopedia Britannica on Jewish population statistics at the end of World War II and the increments or reductions in those populations. I have to say there that you can't do meaningful calculations based on those statistics. I've seen people trying to make calculations based on those statistics and saying before World War II there were so many Jews in Poland, so many in Russia, so many in Austria, and doing simple sums on the back of an envelope and proving that nothing happened to them, or very little. You can't do that because you come up against serious, as any statistician will explain, a serious statistician, you come up against insuperable problems of definition. What do you mean by a Pole? What do you mean by a Jew? Even the Jews now can't decide who a Jew is. I'll give you one example. There's an article in last week's newspapers by the head of the German Jewish community, Ignaz Bubis, bitterly angry at the 30,000 Jews who flooded into Germany from Russia, because he says 1/3 of those 30,000 Jews aren't Jews at all. We don't accept that they're Jews. They don't meet our definition of who is a Jew. He's complaining. He said they've come in to Germany because that was the ticket they needed to get out of the Soviet Union. Who is a Pole? Who is a Polish Jew? I mean, remember Hitler invaded Poland in September the 1st, 1939. 3 weeks later, on the 17th, the Russians invaded eastern Poland. They declared the part of Poland they occupied to be part of the Soviet Union. Hitler, meanwhile, had expelled all the Jews from his half of Poland over the demarcation line into the Soviet part. The whole situation becomes hopelessly confused. You can't do meaningful calculations. And the Jews have benefited from that because now they are and now they aren't. Now they're here and now they're not. Now they've got a Hebrew name and now they've got a Goldenberg name. They are what they want to be. They're will-o'-the-wisps. You seek them here, you seek them there. You can't do meaningful calculations on the basis of statistics.
That source was from Irving College.
Yes. Well, I still stick by my opinion that you can't do meaningful statistics on the Jewish problem. The Nazis tried to do it, the Jews have tried to do it. Any attempt comes to grief on the basis of what is the definition of a Jew and what do you mean by an Austrian Jew and all the rest of it. Yes? You next.
For the last 2 decades or so, maybe 3 decades, we've heard that Pope Pius XII covered up the gas chambers. And what I was interested in asking you, because you looked at all the documents, was there any Jewish organizations in Germany, and England, and the United States during the period of 1942, 1945, when Pius XII was accused of covering up, or any Jewish organizations raising the alarm that can be documented that, hey, Hitler's gassing all the Jews?
First of all, I've not seen any documents produced by the Vatican archives which refer to gas chambers. If they did, they would qualify to my mind for the $1,000 reward which I've offered for 20 years. There is no document. The Jewish community began raising a hue and a cry in September 1942. Gerhard Riegner, who was the Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress, who sent an entirely spurious and bogus report to London, demanding that it should be sent to his headquarters in New York, talking about Hitler having just taken a decision to kill millions of Jews, and they were going to be killed by poison gas in gas chambers in Poland. And this is the first time that that legend arises. And if you look in the British archives, you can see how eventually, a few months later, we turned the legend round and used it as propaganda, which we started broadcasting into Germany, which explains where the story then begins to arise from. We were listening to the echo of our own propaganda. But at the same time, in the British archives, and I've got the files here, I could show it to you afterwards if you want, the Foreign Office official who looks at this report, he says, the only references to gas chambers that we've seen are in documents provided to us by the Jewish community, largely because they concern Jews. These people are not reliable sources. They've always exaggerated in the past, and we see no reason to believe these people now. And they went on asking the very pertinent question, why use gas chambers? There are much easier ways of killing people. What's wrong with a good old-fashioned bullet that hasn't let the Russians down until now? A very pertinent question. Yes?
In his book, Anthony Sutton's book, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, have you heard that book?
I've heard the title of the book, I haven't read it, yes.
Your research has proved that many of the Wall Street bankers have financed many projects in Europe.
If you look in my book, Churchill's War, you'll find I quote a document, a rather unusual document. The question is, did Wall Street bankers finance Hitler? I know what you mean, what you're getting at. The German Chancellor Brüning, before Hitler, Hitler's predecessor, he wrote memoirs when he fled from Germany in 1938. He came to the United States eventually, and his papers are in Syracuse University in New York, where I've seen them. He wrote a letter to Churchill in 1937, after he had already gone into exile. And in this letter to Winston Churchill, Brüning, the German Chancellor, said, if you knew the problems I had as Chancellor, said, I discovered that the major Jewish banks in Berlin had been financing Hitler, and that one of the banks was controlled by the head of the Jewish community. I have a copy of this letter. Now, after World War II, Winston Churchill wrote to Brüning, the Chancellor, who was by then living in the United States, and asked Brüning's permission to quote that letter in his 6-volume history of the Second World War. And Brüning wrote a reply to Churchill saying, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm very sorry to have to refuse your permission to quote that letter. It was true what I wrote at the time in 1937, but given what has happened to the Jewish community in the years since then at the hands of the Nazis whom they financed, it would be too tragic for this fact ever to become known. And so Churchill wasn't permitted to quote the letter. And I have all these letters because they're in the files of the Time Life organization, which published the American edition of the Churchill memoirs at Columbia University in the archives of the then editor of Life magazine, Daniel Longwell. And like going through his private papers, I found copies of these Churchill-Brüning letters, which are very interesting indeed, of course. Needless to say, that didn't stop me from quoting them in my book, Hitler's War. Yes? Yeah. Well, Hitler took money from whoever was foolish enough to give it to him. And in this case, the people were very foolish indeed. You wanted to ask a question here? Yes.
Yes.
We'll have 2 or 3 more questions, then I think we'll wind up the evening. Yeah.
Well, I'm one of those that believes our Bill of Rights, our freedom of speech, is being wiped out by the United Nations Charter and
Yes.
replaced our Constitution.
Yes.
And I'd love it if you do research, or have you already, on the United Nations and its influence on freedom of speech.
The influence of the United Nations on freedom of speech. Well, I can only repeat what I said at the very beginning of my talk, which is how dear and how precious I hold your First Amendment rights in this country as a foreigner visiting this country and benefiting from those rights. And I deeply regret that you don't seem to cherish the First Amendment right as much as we do, who suffer from other countries where the freedom of speech is progressively eroded, and where a scientist can be sent to prison, as in Germany now, because he comes up with a politically incorrect chemical result. This would be unthinkable in this country. And I only hope that you stand firm to the flag of your First Amendment rights in this country, and you don't allow any power to erode them or to depredate them, whether the United Nations or any other power. I strongly mistrust the United Nations, and I can't wait for the day when it finally collapses and implodes. Yes. I've seen stories that Jenny Jerome, the mother of Churchill, was Jewish, and this has been reported in a Jerusalem newspaper, I think, a few months ago. And now I'm obviously looking into that she had Jewish blood in her maternal line. Very interesting indeed. I don't think Churchill was cognizant of that fact. He never mentioned it. But what is interesting are his links with the Jewish community, which I'll go into in a little bit of detail here. Because they've not been gone into by any of the other Churchill biographers for obvious reason. In particular, the main authorized Churchill biographer, Martin Gilbert, hasn't gone into it for the simple reason that he's one himself, and he doesn't want to harp on that fact. But the two basic areas of interest to look at in Churchill's career are the period when he was in the so-called wilderness, when he resigned from Stanley Baldwin's cabinet as a minister, and for the next 10 years, until 1939, he was out of office, out of any office at all. He was just a member of Parliament. So all he had was his salary as a member of Parliament and his rather pitiful earnings as a journalist, and yet somehow he managed to support an enormous country estate, which cost a very large sum of money to support, with all the gardeners and the nurseries and the nurses and the nannies and the cooks and the housekeepers and all the rest of it. He had a private staff of sometimes 20 or 30 people, all supported on his salary as a member of Parliament, which was at that time £500 per annum, $750 a year, or $2,000 actually, because at that time I think it was $4 to the pound. How did he do it? Well, the answer is that from 1936 onwards, he was financed by a little secret pressure group called the Focus. You won't find much reference to the Focus in the history books, but it certainly existed, and there are several files of Churchill's private papers relating to the Focus. The Focus was a group of perhaps 30 or 40 leading British industrialists and bankers and former politicians who decided that Churchill was worth keeping afloat, and they funded him. They weren't all Jews. They were primarily Jewish, but there were also left-wing socialists and left-wing conservative members of Parliament who all decided to keep him afloat. In July 1936, the then chairman of the British, of the Shell Petroleum Company, wrote out a cheque for Churchill of the order of £40,000, which in modern day money would be probably about $700,000, and gave it to him as a gift. He was Jewish. It was a Jewish gift to Churchill, and the intention was that Churchill, they bought him. He became the Pied Piper from that moment on, and the one who pays the piper calls the tune. If you look at the events as they really happened, until 1936, he hardly gave Germany a passing mention in his speeches and writings. Other things were more important. From 1936 onwards, he began beating the anti-Nazi, anti-German drum. And at that time, there was a great deal of pro-German sentiment in Britain, as witnessed the behavior of the Duke of Windsor, the King. King Edward VIII, who ruled for just less than a year after the death of his father, was very pro-German and pro-Hitler, and actually got on very well with Adolf Hitler when he visited Germany later in 1937. He was forced to abdicate by the same lobby, but it was this lobby which was financing Churchill from 1936 onwards, and which finally maneuvered and engineered his introduction into the cabinet in 1939, and finally his taking over as Prime Minister in 1940. He fought a war that Britain had no real interest in. And I've repeatedly said this. Any logical perception of World War II now, looking back after 50 years, screams to the high heavens. And we can see quite clearly that we should have said to the Poles in 1939, you've got a problem with the Germans, sort it out yourself. We should have said to the Jews, you've got a problem with the Nazis, sort it out yourself. It's no concern of Britain and the British Empire. We've got other fish to fry. That's what we should have said. Churchill, unfortunately, was beholden to these people, and he had no alternative. So in 1940, when we had a choice put to us of accepting the very generous peace offer that was put to us, which has been concealed from the history books by the Germans, or of fighting a totally senseless war onwards, Churchill took the wrong turning and bankrupted Britain and ruined the British Empire. I first said this in my book, Churchill's War in 1987, and now 5 other major historians have said the same thing. This has now become known as the revisionist line of history of the Second World War, and I'm the one who actually opened up that path, making people think the unthinkable, looking at the alternative route that we could have taken in 1940. In 1941, just to end this, it becomes very interesting indeed, because the Weizmann papers, which are the papers of Chaim Weizmann, who was the first president of the State of Israel, and he was the leader of the international Zionist movement throughout World War II. The Weizmann archives, foolishly or wisely, gave me complete access to all the Weizmann correspondence with Churchill. And in the Weizmann archives, all Churchill's correspondence with Weizmann throughout the war years and before the war, and all his notes on his meetings with Churchill. And I'm only going to mention one of those letters here. It's a letter written by Chaim Weizmann, the leader of the Zionist movement, at that time living in the United States, to Winston Churchill in September 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor, when Churchill is frantically trying to claw the United States into his war, because that's his only salvation. And Weizmann writes to Churchill a letter which he says, Mr. Prime Minister, unless you grant us what we want, which is the creation of a Jewish army in the Middle East, with our own arsenal and our own weapons and our own uniform and our own flag, unless you grant us what we want, then you are not going to win us over. And let me tell you what we will do if you do grant us what we want. If you grant us our wishes, then we will act on your behalf in the United States. And remember, Mr. Churchill, he writes in this letter, remember, we are the only powerful, unified bloc in the United States which solidly backs the British cause in this war. September 1941. Everybody else is basically isolationist. We are the only ethnic, unified group which solidly backs the British cause. We are the only people who are in the position to bring the United States into this war. We did it in the last war, and we can do it again. Needless to say, I quote this letter in volume 2 of my Churchill biography in a chapter called We Did It Before and We Can Do It Again. And I don't expect to get any applause from the newspaper community in Britain for having revealed this letter, but I think it's a very telling document. I'll take 2 more questions and then we'll finish. Yes?
Is there any truth to the idea that Hitler was a descendant of Rothschild?
Any truth to the idea that Hitler was a descendant of Rothschild? I've never heard that before. I don't think so. I think if so, the Rothschilds must have deeply regretted it and they called him the black sheep of the family. Final question. One more. Yes. Last question.
I asked earlier about the PDF camps. I've read from 2 sources that, and this goes directly back to Eisenhower, the prisoner of war camps were designed for starvation of German soldiers, and as many as 1.9 million were murdered. In fact, more were killed in the camps than in the war. And again, you talk to Americans about it, and we want to hold on to this as the last great war, as if it was noble because it was a war, not a peace action, but really it was Christians killing Christians for the pleasure and profit of Jewish banners.
Well, it was a kind of race war, but the episode you touch on, what happened to the German prisoners in the American camps, was in fact investigated in great depth by a friend of mine, Jim Back, who wrote a book called Other Losses, and he's deeply regretted ever since then having written that book. Until he published that book in Canada, he was a widely respected novelist and historian and one of Canada's best writers, doing very well for himself. The moment he published that book in Canada, exactly the same thing happened to him as happened to me since 1977. An attempt to ostracize him, an attempt to ruin him by the organized international Jewish community, determined not to allow any other episode to distract or divert attention from their own episode, which they've labeled the Holocaust. It's a very interesting case study in the distortion of history and in the persecution of those who come up with politically incorrect history.
Follow-up too. Dr. Coleman points out that the pinpoint bombing strategy used in Dresden has been translated directly into our federal emergency management agency, which is why they bumbled so badly in the natural disasters, because they weren't equipped for those military capabilities.
It would be very tactless, I think, for me as a foreigner and as a guest in your country to start commenting on the proprietors of the federal government. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for having turned out this evening. I'm sure you had other more interesting things to do. Thank you.